The moment my daughter-in-law's mother offered me $700 a month to disappear from my son's life, I knew exactly what kind of people were sitting across from me. But what she didn't know was that the poor old woman she spent the entire dinner humiliating earned more money in a single month than her husband made in a year. And when the truth finally came out inside that luxury restaurant, the entire table went silent. Before I tell you what happened that night, subscribe to Sad Drama Stories and comment below. What would you do if someone judged your entire worth by your bank account? Now let me explain how I ended up sitting across from people who thought kindness only belonged to the rich. My son once described me to his in-laws as simple. God, such a small, harmless word. And yet somehow it carried decades of misunderstanding inside it. Simple, not successful, not intelligent, not powerful, just simple. At 36 years old, my son Daniel genuinely believed his mother was an ordinary office employee barely surviving in a tiny apartment alone. And honestly, that was exactly what I wanted him to believe. Because children raised around money often become addicted to appearances. I refused to let that happen to my son, so for his entire life, I hid mine. I never told Daniel I earned over $40,000 a month. Never told him I oversaw international operations for one of the largest logistics corporations in North America. Never told him I owned investment properties in 3 cities. Never told him I had more money sitting quietly in retirement accounts than most people make in several lifetimes. Why? Because I grew up poor enough to understand something rich people often forget. Money changes how people see you long before it changes who you are. And I wanted my son to learn character before comfort, so I lived quietly. Same apartment for 14 years, same old leather handbag, same used Toyota. I bought clothes on sale, cooked my own meals, took the subway to work most mornings despite technically being wealthy enough to hire drivers. Not because I was pretending, because simplicity felt peaceful. Then 3 weeks ago, Daniel called me sounding nervous, not normal nervous, little boy nervous. The kind he used to sound after breaking lamps accidentally as a child. "Mom," he said carefully, "Emily's parents are visiting from London next weekend." Emily was my daughter-in-law, beautiful, polished, perfect manners, the kind of woman who folds cloth napkins during dinner unconsciously. I liked her. But her parents, I already had suspicions. "What about them?" I asked quietly. Daniel hesitated too long. God, that hesitation told me everything immediately. "They want to meet you." Interesting, not "we'd love dinner," but "they want to meet you," like an inspection. I leaned back slowly in my chair. "And what exactly have you told them about me?" Silence. Then finally, "That you work in administration, that you live modestly, that you're simple." There was that word again. Simple, like my entire existence could fit inside a tiny apologetic box. God, I suddenly felt something cold settle inside my chest, not anger exactly. Recognition. Because women like Emily's mother always ask questions before they judge, and I had a feeling she'd already decided exactly who I was. "What restaurant?" I asked. Daniel named one of the most expensive places in the city, of course. The kind of restaurant where waiters describe water like wine. Interesting choice for meeting the supposedly simple mother. "I'll come," I said calmly. Relief flooded his voice instantly. "Thank you, Mom." After hanging up, I sat alone in my apartment quietly for a long time. The room looked exactly like it always had. Soft beige walls, old bookshelves, small dining table near the kitchen window, nothing impressive. Nothing designed to intimidate strangers. And honestly, I loved that, because every object in that apartment existed for comfort instead of performance. Then slowly an idea formed, a dangerous one. If Emily's parents already believed I was poor, what would happen if I leaned into it completely? God, the thought settled over me instantly. I would let them show me exactly who they were. No designer clothes, no jewelry. No polished executive voice. I'd arrive looking like the version of me they already expected. Invisible, forgettable, financially unimpressive. And then I would watch. Because there's something important I learned after 30 years in corporate leadership. The fastest way to understand people is to let them believe you have nothing they can gain from you. Saturday arrived cold and rainy, perfect weather for disappointment. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror wearing the oldest outfit I owned. Gray shapeless dress, worn cardigan, scuffed shoes, no makeup except moisturizer, hair tied back loosely. God, I looked exhausted. Fragile even, perfect. I grabbed my faded canvas tote bag instead of my leather purse and stared at myself one final time. Not one trace of the executive remained. Then quietly, I smiled. Because something told me this dinner was about to reveal much more than anyone expected. The restaurant was exactly the kind of place rich people choose when they want other people to know they're rich. Gold lighting, crystal glasses, piano music soft enough to sound expensive. Even the air smelled polished. The hostess looked at my outfit once before asking, "Are you sure you're in the correct restaurant?" God. That alone told me what kind of night this would be. "Yes," I answered softly. "My son is waiting for me." She nodded politely, though not warmly, and led me through the dining room. People stared, not openly, subtly. The way wealthy people look at someone who doesn't match the atmosphere. And honestly, I noticed every single glance. Then I saw Daniel near the windows, dark suit, perfect posture, anxiety written all over his face. Beside him sat Emily. Cream-colored dress, diamond earrings, perfectly straight hair, beautiful girl. But the second she saw me, her smile froze. God, not because she hated me, because she was embarrassed. Interesting difference. Then I saw her parents. And instantly, everything inside me went cold. Her mother, Victoria, looked like the kind of woman who speaks to waiters without eye contact. Elegant emerald dress, heavy jewelry, perfect makeup, perfect posture. The type of woman who mistakes intimidation for class. Beside her sat Richard. Gray tailored suit, gold watch. Expression permanently stuck between bored and superior. They looked expensive, not warm, expensive. Daniel stood quickly. "Mom, you made it?" Made it. Interesting phrasing, like arriving successfully at the restaurant was somehow uncertain for me. I smiled gently. "Of course, sweetheart." Emily kissed my cheek quickly, too quickly. Then came the introductions. "Mom, Dad, this is Daniel's mother, Evelyn." Not "this is Evelyn Sterling." Not "this is my mother-in-law," just Daniel's mother, like my entire identity existed through my son. Victoria extended her hand carefully. And God, I saw it immediately, the judgment. Her eyes traveled across my cardigan, my shoes, my canvas bag, one long silent inspection. Then she smiled, coldly. "What a pleasure." It wasn't. Richard shook my hand without standing. Strike two. I sat at the far end of the table naturally. No one offered me a better seat. Interesting. The waiter arrived carrying menus covered in French words and no prices. Victoria glanced toward me. "Would you like help understanding the menu?" God, there it was already. The assumption. I lowered my eyes slightly. "Yes, please, I don't eat at places like this very often." Victoria smiled the way people smile at children who struggle reading aloud. "Of course." Then she ordered for me, not with me, for me. "Give her the chicken," she told the waiter. "Something simple." Something simple. The phrase hung in the air like perfume turning sour. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside Emily. He noticed. Good. Victoria started talking immediately after drinks arrived. About London. About property investments. About private schools Emily attended growing up. Every sentence somehow included money. Every story somehow ended with a price tag. We spent nearly $20,000 renovating the wine cellar. Our Paris trip alone cost more than most people's cars. Richard refuses to stay anywhere without proper service. God. People who are truly wealthy rarely talk about money that much. People obsessed with status do. I listened quietly, nodded politely, played my role perfectly. Then Victoria turned toward me suddenly. "And you, Evelyn, what exactly do you do?" Her tone sounded sweet, but I'd spent 30 years negotiating corporate contracts. I knew venom when I heard it. "I work in administration," I answered softly. "Mostly paperwork." Victoria nodded slowly. "Ah, administrative work." Interesting pause afterward, like she mentally downgraded me in real time. "Well," she said finally, "there's dignity in all honest work." God. The way rich people say honest work when speaking to poorer people always sounds horrifyingly patronizing. "Thank you," I replied calmly. Dinner arrived. Tiny portions arranged like museum exhibits. Victoria explained every dish loudly while occasionally glancing toward me to check whether I looked impressed enough. Richard barely acknowledged my existence unless asking passive-aggressive questions. "Do you live alone? Do you still work full-time at your age?" Is Daniel helping support you financially? Ah, there it was, the real concern, not who I was, what I might cost their daughter eventually. I folded my napkin slowly onto my lap. No, I answered softly. My son has his own life. Victoria sighed dramatically. That's admirable. God, I almost smiled. Because women like Victoria always reveal themselves eventually. You just have to stay quiet long enough. By the time dessert arrived, Victoria had already decided exactly who I was. Poor, lonely, financially dependent. A woman her daughter would eventually need to manage. And honestly, watching her build that version of me in her mind was fascinating because she looked so confident doing it. The waiter placed tiny gold-covered desserts in front of us. Victoria smiled proudly. This cake is imported from a private bakery in Paris. $200 per serving? God, imagine needing dessert to announce your social status. I took a small bite quietly. It's very good. Victoria leaned back in her chair elegantly. You know, Evelyn, I admire women like you. Ah, whenever rich people say that sentence, prepare for an insult immediately afterward. You raised Daniel alone, didn't you? I did. That must have been difficult. Her tone carried fake sympathy, the kind people use when discussing tragedy from a safe distance. I managed, Victoria nodded dramatically. Still, it's wonderful Daniel married into stability. Silence. Daniel froze beside Emily instantly. Richard looked down at his wine. Emily stared directly at her plate. God, interesting, they already knew where this conversation was going. I'm sorry, I asked softly. Victoria smiled again. Oh, don't misunderstand me. I simply mean that marriage becomes easier when one family has resources. Resources, such a polite word for money. We helped Daniel and Emily with their down payment, of course. Nearly $50,000. Daniel looked humiliated. Victoria, but she kept going. We also paid for their honeymoon. 3 weeks through Europe, God. Every sentence sounded like an invoice. Then she tilted her head slightly toward me. And you, were you able to contribute anything? There it was, the question, not curiosity, measurement. I lowered my eyes carefully. Not very much. Victoria smiled softly, like she just confirmed something important. Well, she said, every little bit helps. God, the arrogance, not loud arrogance. Worse, polite arrogance. The kind hidden behind perfect manners and expensive lipstick. I glanced toward Daniel. My son looked deeply uncomfortable now. Good, because he needed to see this clearly. Victoria lifted her wineglass again. You know, Richard and I have always believed parents should continue supporting their children, especially when one side of the family cannot contribute equally. Daniel finally snapped. That's enough. The entire table went silent. Victoria blinked. Excuse me? I said that's enough. God, pride hit me unexpectedly right then, not because he defended my money, because he defended my dignity before knowing the truth. Victoria looked stunned. Daniel, I was only trying to help. No, he answered quietly. You were insulting my mother. Interesting. Emily closed her eyes briefly like someone anticipating disaster, and honestly, she was right. Because something inside me had finally gone cold. Not emotional, clear, I folded my napkin carefully onto the table. Then Victoria said the sentence that changed everything. Evelyn, please understand this comes from concern. Concern. God, we don't want Daniel burdened financially later in life. There it was, finally spoken out loud, not implied, not hidden, burden me, my son's burden. I looked directly at her for the first time all evening. And slowly I smiled, not kindly, not timidly, differently. Victoria noticed instantly. Everyone did, because for the first time that night I stopped pretending to be small. You know, I said softly, that's a very interesting word. Victoria frowned slightly. What is? Burden. Silence spread across the table, and suddenly the entire atmosphere changed. Victoria sat straighter immediately. Predators recognize danger the second prey stops acting afraid. And honestly, for the first time all evening, she looked uncertain. I folded my hands calmly across the table. You've spent this entire dinner trying to calculate my value, I said softly. Based on my clothes, my apartment, my job title, I glanced toward the untouched dessert between us. And apparently my ability to contribute financially. Victoria forced a small laugh. I think you're misunderstanding me. God, the favorite sentence of manipulative people everywhere. No, I answered calmly. I understand you perfectly, Richard finally spoke. There's no need to make this emotional. Interesting. Men like Richard always call women emotional the second conversations become uncomfortable for them. Daniel looked pale beside Emily now. Mom, I lifted a hand gently. It's all right. Then I looked back toward Victoria. You know what fascinates me most about wealthy people? Victoria's jaw tightened slightly. What's that? How quickly they mistake visible money for actual superiority. Silence, complete silence. Even nearby tables seemed quieter suddenly. Victoria's expression hardened. I'm not sure why you're becoming defensive. Defensive? God. The woman had spent an hour dissecting my worth like a financial report, and now I was defensive. Interesting, I leaned back slowly in my chair. For 30 years, I said softly, I've worked with executives, investors, and international clients worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The table froze. Daniel blinked. Emily looked confused. Richard actually laughed once. Short. Dismissive. I'm sorry. I smiled gently. No need to apologize. Victoria stared at me carefully now, really carefully, like she'd suddenly noticed something she missed before, not the clothes, the composure. Because here's the thing people misunderstand about power. Real power doesn't usually announce itself loudly. It sits quietly observing until necessary. I oversee logistics operations for North Star International, I continued calmly. I've spent the last 11 years negotiating transportation contracts across 3 continents. Nobody moved. God, the silence felt delicious. Daniel looked completely stunned. Mom, yes, sweetheart, you work for North Star? I run the Eastern Division. Emily's mouth physically opened. Interesting. Apparently Daniel truly knew almost nothing about my professional life. Victoria blinked several times rapidly. That's impossible. Ah, there it was. Not, I misunderstood you. Impossible. Because women like Victoria cannot emotionally process the idea that someone dressed simply might outrank them completely. I tilted my head slightly. Why? Richard leaned forward sharply. North Star International is worth billions. Yes, and you expect us to believe you're some executive there, some executive, God. Men become deeply fragile when reality embarrasses them publicly. I don't expect you to believe anything, I answered calmly. But if you'd like, Daniel can probably Google me right now. Daniel already had his phone in his hand. Interesting, the poor boy looked like his entire childhood was rearranging itself in real time. 3 seconds later, his face lost all color. Oh my God. Emily grabbed the phone instantly, then Richard, then Victoria. And suddenly, the entire table went dead silent. Because staring back at them was my corporate headshot beside an interview from Financial Business Monthly. Evelyn Sterling, Senior Operations Director, North Star International. God. Victoria's face looked almost fascinating, like someone watching the laws of physics collapse in front of her. You, she whispered. I smiled softly. Yes. But Daniel said, I let my son believe I lived simply. Victoria looked physically shaken now. Not because I had money, because she revealed her character before realizing who she was talking to. And honestly, that was the beautiful part. Richard cleared his throat awkwardly. Well, this is certainly unexpected. Interesting how disrespect suddenly disappears after discovering a woman has status. I looked directly at Victoria. You know what's unfortunate? Nobody answered. You spent the entire evening trying to determine whether I was worthy of basic respect. God, she looked genuinely embarrassed now. Good. Not once did you ask whether I was kind. Or whether I loved your daughter. Or whether I raised a good man. I glanced toward Daniel. My son looked emotionally wrecked. And honestly, that tells me everything I need to know. Nobody touched dessert after that. The expensive little gold cakes sat untouched between us while silence swallowed the entire table. Victoria looked completely shattered, not emotionally. Socially, there's a difference. Women like Victoria build their identities around always being the most impressive person in the room, and suddenly she wasn't. Richard recovered first, naturally. Men with large egos usually mistake composure for control. He straightened his suit jacket and forced a stiff smile. Well, he said awkwardly, this has all been one big misunderstanding. God. Interesting how cruelty becomes a misunderstanding the second consequences appear. I looked at him calmly. Was it? Silence. Richard cleared his throat again. We simply didn't realize your situation. My situation, not my career. Not my accomplishments, my situation, because people obsessed with status only understand power through categories. Poor, rich, useful, embarrassing, nothing deeper than that. Daniel finally spoke again. You thought my mother was beneath you? No one answered, which honestly was answer enough. Emily looked horrified now, not cruel horrified, ashamed horrified. And for the first time that night, I actually felt sorry for her. Because children raised by people like Victoria spend their whole lives confusing appearances with morality. Emily reached for my hand carefully. I'm so sorry. God, that one sounded real. I squeezed her fingers gently. This isn't your fault. Victoria inhaled sharply. No, Emily interrupted quietly. You were rude. Interesting. The entire table froze again. Apparently, Emily rarely contradicted her mother publicly. Good for her. Victoria's face tightened immediately. I was trying to protect you. From what? A cardigan? God, I almost laughed. Daniel looked down, suddenly hiding a smile. First crack in the tension all night. Victoria looked furious now. But beneath the anger, I finally saw it. Fear, because powerful, controlling people panic when social authority slips away from them. You intentionally deceived us, Richard said suddenly. Ah, there it was. The attempt to make me the villain instead. Interesting strategy. I tilted my head slightly. How? You allowed us to believe you were struggling financially. No, I answered calmly. You assumed it. Silence, absolute silence. Because he knew I was right, I never lied once. Not about my job, not about my income, not about my life. They simply saw old shoes and decided the rest themselves. And honestly, that's what made the entire thing so revealing. The waiter approached nervously, then holding the bill folder. Poor man looked like he wanted to disappear. Richard immediately reached for it. Of course he did. This dinner was supposed to reinforce his superiority. Publicly paying the bill mattered to him, but before his hand touched the folder, I picked it up first. Richard blinked. Oh, there's no need. I invited myself into your evening, I said softly. It's only fair. Victoria looked deeply uncomfortable suddenly. Probably because she still couldn't calculate whether allowing me to pay would embarrass her further. Interesting internal battle. I opened the folder calmly. Total $2,184. God. Imagine spending $2,000 just to emotionally humiliate someone over seafood. I slid my black corporate card inside without hesitation. The waiter's entire posture changed the second he saw it. Tiny detail. Massive message. People who work around wealth recognize certain cards instantly. Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, interesting, not one person at that restaurant called me ma'am before that moment. The waiter disappeared quickly. And suddenly, Victoria looked like she might physically implode. Daniel stared at me in disbelief. You paid that like it was nothing. I smiled slightly. Because it was. God, that one landed hard, not because of arrogance. Because of contrast. Everything they assumed about me collapsed in under 30 seconds. The waiter returned carrying the receipt with both hands almost respectfully. Thank you, Miss Sterling. Victoria's eyes widened instantly. Because until that moment, she hadn't even known my last name. The drive home with Daniel was painfully quiet. Rain tapped softly against the windshield while city lights blurred across the glass. My son kept glancing at me every few seconds like he was looking at a stranger wearing my face. And honestly, I understood why. For 36 years, Daniel thought his mother was an ordinary woman living paycheck to paycheck. Now suddenly he was realizing he knew almost nothing about me at all. Finally, halfway through the drive, he whispered, "Why didn't you tell me?" God, such a small question, such a massive answer. I looked out the passenger window quietly before speaking. Because I wanted you to become a good man before becoming a rich one. Silence. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter. You thought money would ruin me? No, I answered softly. I thought easy privilege might. That landed. I could feel it. You never cared about brands growing up, I continued quietly. You never judged people. You worked hard. You treated waiters kindly. I smiled faintly. And honestly, I was proud of that. Daniel looked devastated suddenly. But tonight, his voice cracked slightly. I let them talk to you like that. God, there it was, the real wound, not my money, his guilt. I reached over gently and squeezed his arm. You defended me before knowing the truth. He swallowed hard. That should have happened sooner. Yes, I answered honestly. The car went silent again, then quietly. Did you know they were like this? Interesting question, because deep down he already knew the answer. I suspected. Daniel laughed bitterly once. Mom, Victoria offered to help us create a financial protection plan before we got married. God. There it was, the confirmation. She thought you'd become dependent on us eventually, he admitted quietly. She kept warning Emily that you might need money later. Interesting. So they'd been discussing my future like a future burden for months. I felt strangely calm hearing it now, not hurt. Finished, Daniel looked sick. I should have stopped it earlier. You were raised to avoid conflict, I said softly. That's partly my fault. He frowned immediately. What do you mean? God, parenthood is horrifying sometimes. Because eventually you realize every strength you give your children also creates weaknesses somewhere else. I taught you kindness, I whispered, but maybe I taught you comfort with silence too. Daniel stared ahead at the rain-covered road quietly, and honestly, I could see the realization happening in real time. The understanding that staying quiet while someone gets disrespected is still participation. When we reached my apartment building, Daniel parked but didn't turn off the engine. He just sat there gripping the wheel. Then finally, "Are you disappointed in me, God?" That question nearly broke my heart completely, because suddenly he sounded 6 years old again. I turned toward him carefully. "No, but I think tonight disappointed you." His eyes filled immediately. Interesting, my son almost never cried, not openly. "I thought they were classy people," he whispered. "I thought Emily's family was better." Better than what? Silence. Then he looked down. God, there it was. The thing underneath everything. Better than us. Better than his quiet mother in old cardigans. I reached into my bag and pulled out the tiny diner receipt from years earlier that I still carried inside my wallet. Faded paper, coffee stain near the corner. Daniel frowned. "What's that?" "You were 8 years old." I handed it to him. His face changed instantly. Oh my God. The receipt came from a tiny roadside diner. Total bill. $11.42 on the back, written in childish handwriting. "Mom works harder than everyone, God." Daniel used to sneak notes into my purse when he was little. I kept every single one. "I never needed you to become rich," I said softly. "I only needed you to stay kind." Tears rolled down his face immediately then, real ones, not dramatic, quiet, ashamed, and honestly. That mattered more to me than the restaurant reveal ever did, because money can expose people. But remorse changes them. 3 weeks after the restaurant dinner, Victoria called me. God. I actually stared at my phone for a full 10 seconds before answering. Because honestly, women like Victoria rarely apologize. They reorganize blame, they justify behavior. They explain why you misunderstood them, but apologize. Almost never. Still, I answered. "Hello, Victoria." Silence lingered briefly on the line. Then softly, "I owe you an apology." God, well, that was unexpected. I sat slowly beside my apartment window while rain tapped against the glass again. Interesting coincidence. The weather matched the night everything changed. "You humiliated me," Victoria admitted quietly. But after thinking about it, she exhaled shakily. "I realized I humiliated myself first." Now that surprised me, because self-awareness usually terrifies people obsessed with status. "I judged you immediately," she continued. "Your clothes, your apartment, your mannerisms." I smiled faintly to myself. "You mean my cardigan?" God, to my surprise, Victoria laughed softly, first genuine sound I'd ever heard from her. "Yes, the cardigan." Silence settled between us more comfortably this time. Then quietly, "My father was poor when I was young." Interesting, there it was, the real story. People obsessed with status almost always have fear underneath somewhere. "He worked constantly," she whispered, "and wealthy people treated him terribly. I promised myself I'd never live like that again." God, I understood suddenly. Victoria didn't worship wealth because she loved money. She worshipped it because she feared humiliation. And somewhere along the way, she became the exact kind of person who once hurt her family. Funny how trauma repeats itself wearing different clothes. "I spent years teaching Emily that appearances protect women," she admitted. "But after meeting you," she paused. "You seemed more secure in yourself than anyone I know." That one hit unexpectedly hard, because honestly, security was something I fought decades to build quietly, not through money, through surviving. I'm still angry with you, I admitted gently. You should be, but I appreciate the honesty. Another pause, then Victoria asked quietly, why did you really hide your success from Daniel? I looked around my small apartment slowly. The bookshelves, the soft lighting, the old wooden table beside the kitchen, peaceful, real, because I wanted my son to love people before ranking them. Silence. Then softly, you succeeded. God, that mattered more than she probably realized. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time thinking about how strange human beings are. How pain travels through generations unless someone finally decides to stop carrying it forward. A month later, Daniel and Emily invited me to dinner again. This time at a tiny family-owned Italian restaurant with paper menus and mismatched chairs. God, I loved it instantly. No gold-covered desserts. No violin music. No performance, just warmth. Daniel hugged me the second I walked in, longer than usual, like he was still apologizing silently. Emily smiled nervously, then whispered, Mom's coming too. Interesting. Victoria arrived 5 minutes later wearing almost no jewelry. And honestly, I barely recognized her. Not because she looked poorer, because she looked softer, more human somehow. Dinner started awkwardly, carefully. But halfway through the meal, something unexpected happened. Our waiter accidentally spilled water near Victoria's plate. The poor boy panicked immediately. I'm so sorry, ma'am. Old Victoria would have destroyed him publicly. I know that now. Instead, she smiled gently. It's all right. Then she helped him clean it up. God, the boy looked stunned. And honestly, so did Emily. Interesting how small moments reveal whether people truly changed. Later that night, while Daniel paid the bill, Victoria looked at me across the table quietly. Then softly, you know, I almost offered you money that night. I nearly laughed. Almost, she groaned immediately. Oh, it gets worse. I was going to offer you $700 a month to move closer to assisted living. God, this woman almost paid me an allowance like a retired raccoon. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled wine. And surprisingly, Victoria laughed too. Real laughter this time, not polished, not strategic. Human. Then she looked at me carefully. You know what bothers me most? What? You seemed perfectly comfortable before anyone knew you were wealthy. Interesting observation. Because she was right. I spent years thinking money created dignity, she admitted quietly. But you already had dignity before entering that restaurant. God, that one stayed with me because honestly, that was the entire point. Money can buy status, comfort, access, but dignity comes from knowing your worth before anyone else confirms it. When dinner ended, Daniel wrapped his arm around my shoulders while we walked outside together. Cold air, city lights. Soft music drifting from nearby bars. Then quietly he whispered, You know I'm proud of you. God, such simple words, but children never outgrow a parent's need to hear them. I smiled and squeezed his hand once. And honestly, that mattered more to me than the expensive restaurant, more than the corporate reveal, more than Victoria's apology. Because at the end of the day, I didn't raise my son to admire wealth. I raised him to recognize humanity. And thankfully, he finally did. Before you go, comment below, do people reveal their true character by how they treat those they believe have less than them? And remember, the strongest people in the room are often the ones who no longer need the room's approval at all.